Genesis chapter 19, before we get into chapter 20, we see the origin of the Moabites and the Ammonites. Of course, we know that Lot and his two daughters engaged in evil activity. Both of those two daughters conceived children. Verse 37, the firstborn bore a son, called his name Moab, and he is the father or the ancestor of the Moabites to this day. So anytime you read throughout the Old Testament scriptures about the Moabites, here is the origin of those people. Verse 38, as for the younger, she also bore a son and called his name Ben-Ami. He is the father of the sons of Ammon to this day. That would be, of course, the Ammonites. So anytime you read in Scripture about the Ammonite people, anytime they're mentioned, this is the origin of them. This is, as you read verses 30 through 38, a terrible, immoral situation. They were born out of incest, out of drunkenness, and so that's just a terrible origin to any children or any group of people. Of course, we remember in chapter 19 the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Those wicked cities were destroyed for their wickedness. And, of course, they're no more from this point on. And all throughout the Scriptures, it's interesting when you read the prophets and when you read even into the New Testament, Jesus will mention Sodom and Gomorrah. The New Testament writers will mention Sodom and Gomorrah as an example of God punishing wickedness. And even throughout the Scriptures in the Old Testament, you'll find the Old Testament prophets saying to Israel, you're acting like Sodom and Gomorrah. And when you understand their wickedness, you can understand why that was an insult to them, that God was saying, you're wicked like they were. And so they became pretty much a symbol of wickedness in a wicked society. Chapter 20 and verse 1. Now Abraham journeyed from there towards the land of Negev and settled between Kadesh and Shur. Then he sojourned to Gerar. Verse 2. Abraham said to Sarah, his wife, she is my sister. So Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. Here we have Abraham repeating a mistake that he did in chapter 12. Abraham, and I guess all of us can say we all have problems with sin in our life, as things that we struggle with. It seemed that Abraham had a problem with lying. This is the second time he is lying to a king and to people about Sarah. It happened in chapter 12 with the Egyptian Pharaoh. And here in Gerar, you have Abimelech, the king, taking Sarah to be his wife. And Abraham is saying, she is my sister. And as we're going to see later on, that's a half-truth. But a half-truth is a whole lie. It is deception. Verse 3. But God came to Abimelech in a dream of the night and said to him, verse 3, behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is married. Now, when God appears to you in a dream, like he did to Abimelech, and basically says, you're a dead man, that's pretty severe. You are a dead man because you have taken another man's wife. And so here you have God speaking to Abimelech. You notice in chapter 12, when Abram lied about Sarai, in that context, God sent plagues upon the nation of Egypt because of what the Pharaoh had done in taking Sarai. Here you have God appearing to Abimelech here and saying, you have taken another man's wife. you are a dead man. Verse 4. Now Abimelech had not come near her, and he said, Lord, will you slay a nation even though it is innocent or blameless? Did he not himself say to me, she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands, I have done this. So here you have Abimelech speaking to God, praying to God, and saying, are you going to destroy and slay the whole nation because of something that we did in innocence? He probably most likely understood about what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. Word would have spread throughout the world of that time. Word of mouth or historical documents, so to speak. The news would have spread of what happened to those cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abimelech is saying, I did this with all good intention. And so we even find out in verse 5 that Sarah was involved in the lie. She is my sister, that's what Abraham said, and Sarah said, verse 5, he is my brother. So not only did Abraham lie, he got his wife to lie and brought all this problem upon Gerar and Abimelech the king. And so here you have a situation where Abimelech is doing something out of ignorance based upon a lie, but yet it did not take away his accountability. It did not take away his accountability. He knew the truth because God revealed that truth to him, and what was he going to do after that? What would he do with the information that he knew concerning the will of God? And I think this is a good example or a lesson for us, for so many people who ask the question, what about people who just don't know? People who just don't know and have never heard the gospel, never heard the truth, are they accountable for their actions? And I believe verses 3 through 5 tell us that a person doing something out of ignorance still does not take away their accountability. And so many people are lied to, like Abraham and Sarah lied to Abimelech. They're lied to, religiously speaking, but that doesn't take away their accountability. And especially in our nation, when we have the Word of God readily available to everyone in various different English versions and in other languages, there's really no excuse not to know the truth. And so there is still a sense of accountability. And Abimelech is saying, I did this with all good intention. But still that didn't take away his accountability. Verse 6. Then God said to him in a dream, yes, I know that in the integrity of your heart you have done this, and I also kept you from sinning against me. Therefore I did not let you touch her. So God spoke to Abimelech, let him know this is another man's wife. You're a dead man. You've taken another man's wife. And he says, because I know, verse 6, of the integrity of your heart. We don't know much about Abimelech, but he seems to be a pretty good guy. And I want you to keep that in mind as we draw some conclusions from this a little bit later on in the chapter. Abimelech seems to be a pretty good guy. And so God says, I know in the integrity of your heart you were deceived. And I know in the integrity of your heart that you did this. And you have, and I have kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. For some reason, somehow, God kept Abimelech from engaging in relations with Sarah. Verse 7. Now, therefore, restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you will live. But if you do not restore her now, that you have not now store her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours. So here's the responsibility Abimelech has now. You restore her. She is another man's wife. You give her back to Abraham. And here's the first time we have in the Bible, and to my knowledge probably the only time, I might be wrong about this, that Abraham is called a prophet. He's called a patriarch all throughout the Scriptures. In the New Testament, he is referred to as a patriarch. But I believe this might be the only place where Abraham is referred to as a prophet. God calls Abraham a prophet. So here you have a little bit more insight into who Abraham was. He was not only the forefather of the entire Hebrew people, he was a prophet, God's spokesman. God spoke through him. So he had a special place in that sense of being a prophet of God. And perhaps this might be the first mention of the word prophet in the Bible. I believe that might be the case, that this is the first time the word prophet is used, and it is used here to describe Abraham. You give her back. You cannot keep her. You see, when a person realizes they're in an unscriptural situation, you've got to get out of it. Abimelech couldn't just keep Sarah and say, well, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know, and then go ahead and keep her. He had to repent. That repentance demanded that he get out of a relationship with her, even though he did not consummate the relationship with intimacy. So he had a responsibility to give her back. And so he did this. And he says, if you don't, in verse 7, you're going to die, and all of yours will die as well. Verse 8, so Abimelech arose early in the morning. This is probably a dream at night. He got up early in the morning, called all his servants and told them all these things in their hearing, and the men were greatly frightened. You see, Abimelech didn't wait. He did not wait to think it over. He didn't think. It didn't seem like he was thinking about how he felt towards Sarah. He understood the urgency of doing what was right. And so he told it to all the people early in the morning, and all the men were frightened, verse 9. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, what have you done to us? And how have you sinned against, or how have I sinned against you, that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me these things that you ought not have done. So he's asking, what did you do this for? Why? Why did you do this? And it's all because Abraham, for some reason, lied again. See how much trouble lying causes. Abraham thought he was really, protecting himself and Sarah, but it caused so much problems for everyone else. There is never a good reason to lie. Never. Never a good situation in which lying is a viable, right option. There's always the option, and if you're stuck in a situation where you know the truth could be damaging in some way, not to say anything. I think we call it in our society pleading the fifth. Don't say anything. Don't say a word. Instead of lying, bring condemnation upon yourself and others, getting others to lie, as Abraham got Sarah to lie. And so he's asking, what have you done? Why have you done this? You have done to me these things that ought not be done. In verse 10, Abimelech said to Abraham, what have you encountered that you have done this thing? In other words, what have you seen? Why? Why are you doing this? And here you have Abimelech, probably a pagan believer in many gods, which would be a safe assumption. And here he is getting on to a prophet of God, the one true God, and asking him, why were you dishonest with me? God revealed to me in a dream and told me that you're a prophet. Why did you lie to me? So there was no really any good excuse or reason for Abraham to be dishonest with him, especially when you look and you see the character of Abimelech. As I said before, he seemed to be a pretty good guy and would not have done this, would not have done any harm to Abraham or Sarah if he knew right off the bat that they were married. So, verse 11, here's Abraham's response. He said, because I thought surely there is no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Verse 12, besides, she actually is my sister, the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. In other words, after all, she's my half-sister. That didn't make it right, though. She was his half-sister, according to the explanation there in verse 12, but he distorted the facts to make it look like that's all they were, brother and sister. And still, that's dishonest. That's telling a lie. Even if you mix a little bit of truth with a lie, it's still a lie. It's still a distortion. And so he did lie, and it caused all kinds of problems. Verse 13, and it came about when God caused me to wander from my father's house, Abraham's still talking, that I said to her, this is the kindness which you will show to me everywhere we go. Say of me, he is my brother. So not only was Abraham lying himself, but he was getting Sarah to lie about her situation. Never does any good. Lying in any situation. Yes. Right. The worst lie that you can invent is to tell the truth with ill intent. That's a Johnny Ramseyism. That is true. And to speak partial truth, distort the facts, and mix it with a little bit of lies, it still does not accomplish what a person is supposed to accomplish as far as doing the will of God. Here you have this king who may not know the one true God very well, telling the prophet of God, Abraham, you lied to me. Kind of a backward situation. And it's very interesting. This also shows the inspiration of the Scriptures, because here, of course, Moses is writing this by inspiration, and he is not glossing over the fact that Abraham lied and Sarah lied. He's just telling the facts like it is. Here's what happened. Abraham and Sarah, the ancestor of the entire Hebrew nation, at this point in their life, lied. And not only did they do it here, they did it back in chapter 12. So the Bible doesn't whitewash the sins of its heroes. It just tells, here's what happened. Here's what they did. Now, for the most part, Abraham was a righteous man, but he had his faults, and so did Sarah. She had her faults, and here we have them presented. Look at verse 14. Abimelech then took sheep and oxen and the male and female servants and gave them to Abraham and restored his wife Sarah to him. Abimelech said, behold, my land is before you. Settle wherever you please. Verse 16. To Sarah he said, behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Behold, it is your vindication before all who are with you, and before all men you are cleared. Verse 17. Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife and his maids, so that they bore children. Verse 18. For the Lord had closed fast all the wombs of the household of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. So it caused the household of Abimelech, not only his wife, but also his servants, for them not to bear children, as a result of Abraham's and Sarah's sin. Now, there are 3 lessons that we can get from chapter 20 that I get from it as I look at this chapter. Number 1, always, in every circumstance, tell the truth. Tell the truth. It does no good in any circumstance to lie. And even though, sometimes we don't really face, a lot of times in our life and death situations when it deals with telling the truth or not, but sometimes to cover embarrassment we'll lie, or we'll distort the facts, or will tell little half-truths? What about somebody telling a story or recounting a story in which they were involved, and they delete a few things and they kind of enhance some of the things that they did to make themselves look good? They distort the facts, kind of embellish a little bit. Well, that's lying. That's lying. That's dishonesty. We, under every circumstance, should tell the truth. And the second thing, I think this goes along with it, if Abraham did fear for his life, he should have trusted God. What did God say to him earlier? He appeared to him and spoke to him and told him He was Almighty God, chapter 17 and verse 1. Walk before me and be blameless. Well, He's not doing this at this point. He's not being blameless. He said in chapter 15, Genesis 15, in verse 1, do not fear, Abram. I am your shield and I am your reward. I am your shield. I am your protection. He should have trusted God and went into this area where Abimelech was king and said, well, I'm this. If they ask me, yes, this is my wife. God is going to protect me. He said He would. He said He was my shield. And so when you look at that, you see his lack of trust. And the third thing I get from chapter 20 is, never assume anything. Never assume anything. Abraham assumed that Abimelech was part of a wicked society. And that's why he said, verse 11, I thought surely there is no fear of God in this place. I thought this is how it was. There is no fear of God in this place, and they'll kill me because of my wife. He assumed it might be the same situation that happened years ago back in Egypt. And he was making that assumption, saying, well, I just assumed that this is how it's going to be. But it turned out Abimelech was a good guy. Do not judge a book by its cover. It's very interesting in my experience in studying with certain people, trying to convert people. There are people that I assumed, that I thought, I almost convinced in my mind as I was studying with them, they're going to obey the gospel and become a Christian. And they don't. Then there are others that I study with and I think they don't care. There's no concern there. They don't have any spiritual interest at all. And lo and behold, they obey the gospel, become Christians, and become faithful to the Lord. And I assumed they wouldn't. Thought they'd be the last person that really would listen to spiritual matters. You can't assume anything. And I think Abraham here is assuming something about Abimelech. And when you read chapter 20, it kind of turns out that Abimelech was a good guy. God speaks to Abimelech and tells him that I know that you did this in integrity, verse 6. In the integrity of your heart you have done this. See, Abimelech thought she was available. Thought he could marry her. But it was, of course, based upon deception, based upon a lie. And when Abimelech learned the truth, he got everything squared away and made everything right. And even questioned Abraham, said, why have you done this? So there's almost, seems like an amazement and an unbelief on Abimelech's part that Abraham, who is a prophet, verse 7, would do this, would deceive him like this. And so he recompenses for his actions. Verse 14, gave them sheep, oxen, male and female servants. That was an expensive gift back then, a wonderful gift. And also 1,000 pieces of silver, and said, this is for your vindication. Verse 16. And then Abraham prayed, and the household of Abimelech was able to bear children after that. So there you have Abraham making a mistake, repeating a mistake that he had done back in chapter 12 here in chapter 20. Any questions or comments about this? Yes. Exactly. I was going to bring that up, but it slipped my mind. We're not told, and sometimes we read through this and we think this happened in a 2 or 3 day period of time. It must have been a while for him to be there for this to happen. So that's a good point. That it must have been a while for this to happen, for them to understand that the wombs of their household had been closed. Honesty is the best policy. Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Joseph in Potiphar's house, that we'll get to eventually in the book of Genesis. Potiphar's wife tried to get Joseph to have relations with her, and he said, I cannot do this. I cannot do this great sin against my God, and left and had to leave his coat behind. So that's a good example of this. And Abimelech was doing this in the integrity of his heart. So when he learned the truth, he immediately made changes and restored the one who did not belong to him, and tried to make things right as best he could. As I said, we don't know much about Abimelech, but he seems like a pretty good guy. I mean, later on, when we study the book of Exodus, we're going to find Pharaoh. I mean, how many plagues does it take for Pharaoh to actually let the people go? And then after the 10th plague and they're gone out towards the Red Sea, he says, I'm going after them again. I mean, his heart hardens and hardens and hardens to the point where the whole Egyptian army has to be killed off in the Red Sea because of his stubbornness. Chapter 21, we have the birth of the promised son, that promised seed. Genesis 21 and verse 1, then the Lord took noticed Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he promised. Verse 2. So Sarah conceived and bore a son. Notice conception, the beginning point, starting point of life, all through the Bible. Conception is the beginning point. So Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the appointed time of which God had spoken to him. Remember what God said when he appeared in human form to Abram. You're going to produce a child. You're going to have a child. Abraham laughed about it. Sarah laughed about it. And here it is coming to pass. Verse 3, Abraham called the name of his son whom he bore to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Notice verse 3 is emphasizing Abraham and Sarah were intimate with one another, and they bore a son. This was not Abraham through a handmaiden. This was no other way except God miraculously allowed them to have the ability, even in their old age, to be intimate with one another and to conceive a son. Verse 4, then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Here he is performing the command to circumcise. And here you have Abraham obeying that as a sign of the covenant. Verse 5, now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now, he's going to live to be about 75 years beyond this. He's going to die at about 175 years old. And remember, when he was initially called back in chapter 12, he was told in chapter 12, when he was initially called, verse 2, I will make you a great nation and I will bless you. He says in verse 7, God appeared to him and said, to your descendants I will give this land. There was a promise all the way back to chapter 12. Your descendants would possess the land. Your descendants would be the ones that will become a great nation. And through your descendants, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. If you look at chapter 12 and verse 4, it says, Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. That promise was given to Abram at the age of 75. That you're going to have descendants and they're going to grow into a great nation. It wasn't until he was 100 that the promise came true. What's that, about 25 years? I'm not good with the numbers. That's about 25 years, right? 25-year period of time from between the time the promise was given that this would happen and it actually took place. Remember, they kind of got a little bit ahead of things and said, well, let's try it this way. God has not given us the promised child, so let's try with Hagar. They, again, tried to circumvent the plan of God because he wasn't working as fast as they hoped. But it was 25 years later that the promise would be fulfilled. You know, it's interesting when you get into the book of Exodus. Moses was about 80 years old when he was called to deliver the children of Israel out of Egyptian bondage. See, God does not always work on a time schedule that we think He should work on. And so we need to understand that we need to be patient when we're asking God something in harmony with His will, that we will get it. And sometimes it's not instantaneous. I'm glad in my early 20s and my mid-20s I didn't marry some of the girls I dated. It would have been a huge mistake. I'm glad the Lord allowed me to have time to grow up myself, be mature, and find a good Christian woman that would be a great companion. And so, Jennifer will tell you that she didn't marry according to her prescribed timetable. She thought she was going to marry early in her 20s. Didn't happen that way. But I believe that things work out, and we have to be patient with praying according to God's will and seeing them come to a reality in our life. Sometimes that'll take years down the road because we're not ready for it yet. When I was 20, 21, 22, I wasn't ready for marriage. Certainly wasn't ready for it. And so there are things that we have to go through, and evidently God knew that Abraham and Sarah had to go through for them to be at the right stage in their life to have this promised son. Look at verse 6, Genesis 21 and verse 6. Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. Isaac's name means laughter. It means laughter. Verse 7. And she said, who would have said to Abraham and Sarah that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Verse 8. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that he was weaned. Being weaned, of course, in that society meant something very special, and that happened about the years 2 or 3 years of age that the child would be weaned. And so there was a great feast that was made in honor of Isaac at that time. Now we're going to revisit some old problems again. See, when you do things according to your own wisdom, sometimes those problems stick with you throughout the rest of your life. And here's what you have here with chapter 21 and verse 9. You have Hagar and Ishmael being a problem. Well, that wouldn't have even been a problem if if Abraham wouldn't have got ahead of God's plan. The situation with Lot was brought to my attention last time we met on a Wednesday night. The situation with Lot, Abraham having to go rescue Lot, and then Lot going down into Sodom, and all that problem with Lot and his family going down in the city of Sodom and Gomorrah wouldn't have been a problem if Abraham in chapter 12 would have obeyed when God said, you leave your family behind. You leave your family behind. Abram didn't fully obey. He took Lot with him. So, when we don't fully and completely obey what God tells us to do, it comes with problems and consequences. Genesis 21 and verse 9. Now Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking or making fun. Mocking Isaac, the implication is there. So here you have Ishmael causing problems. He would have been a teenager about this time. Causing problems for Isaac. Verse 10, therefore, she said to Abraham, drive out this maid and her son, for the son of this maid will not be an heir with my son Isaac. So here again you're seeing conflict. Ishmael is causing problems. And so Sarah's saying, get rid of her and him. They're causing problems. They're not going to be heirs with my son. Verse 11. The matter distressed Abraham greatly because of his son. Remember, Ishmael is Abraham's son. Not only Isaac, but Ishmael is Abraham's son. Verse 12. And God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the lad and your maid. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her, for through Isaac your descendants shall be named. The one who is going to be the chosen descendant and the one that would be the ancestor to all of these blessings that God promised would be Isaac. Ishmael is not going to somehow get in on that. Isaac is going to be the one. He is the chosen one. Verse 13, and of the son of the maid I will make a great nation, or I will make a nation also, because he is your descendant. Remember, we were told earlier, nations, plural, would come from Abraham. Well, Ishmael came from Abraham through Hagar. And so Ishmael is going to become a nation. In fact, the Edomites will come from Ishmael. Verse 14, so Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar, putting them on her shoulder, and gave her the boy and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. So here you have Abraham dealing with the situation, sending her away. And so here you have, once again, they're being placed out of the household. This happened earlier, but here you have it again, and this is a permanent thing. They're going to be gone, and they're going to be gone for good. The skin of water, of course, verse 14, refers to the animal skins. That's how you would carry water back then. You'd have leather pouches full of water, and that would be your canteen or water bottle, so to speak. So that's how they would carry their water in olden times. We'll continue with chapter 21, not next week, because that's singing, I believe. I believe that's right. The following Wednesday after that.